Hi guys, welcome back to my channel. My name is Louisa. If you're new, welcome. Don't forget to subscribe, and if you're coming back, welcome back. So it is football season in Australia. That means that it's winter. And it also means that I get out my Broncos scarf, because you can take the girl out of Queensland, but you cannot take the Queenslander out of the girl.
Played by him and now goes to the left for Thurston. The kick is beautiful. No, it's a try for Inglis. Inglis has put it down.
Okay, now we've gotten that out of the way. Today's video, I wanted to kind of elaborate on something that I touched on in my last video, which was how when you convert to Christianity, you inevitably come up against all of this pressure to renounce it. As Jesus said, the servant is not greater than the master, and if people hated him first, then they will definitely hate you. And ultimately, Christianity is about pleasing God rather than pleasing people. So as you can imagine, this becomes a bit of a challenge, because when it comes to proclaiming the gospel, if you are actually proclaiming the true gospel, you're going to trigger people. People are going to call you judgmental, and they are also going to call you a liar, and they're basically going to kind of do the ad hominem thing, which is something that I've come across quite a bit, especially in the comments on YouTube. People will attack me as a person in an attempt to undermine what it is that I'm saying. Ad hominem is a logical fallacy that people tend to trot out when they actually can't really address the subject matter. They can't offer a rebuttal to what it is that you're actually talking about. So rather than addressing the topic, instead they turn around and attack you on a personal level. So they might go for things like your appearance, or they might go for things like your past mistakes or things along that line. And so it's not really engaging with the topic. Instead, it's just trying to tear you down as a person. So sometimes there's a fine line between someone who is actually addressing someone else's behavior and someone who is actually committing this particular logical fallacy. You kind of have to use a bit of judgment on that one. And this is one of the reasons why people don't talk about their mental health struggles. Like, people don't talk about having anxiety, they don't talk about having PTSD, and they don't talk about having depression, because people capitalize on that. They basically take this as proof that you're stupid or that you cannot use reasoning. So because I've made very public accounts of having PTSD, people are like, oh, she has PTSD, therefore she is stupid and cannot use reasoning and logic. So yeah, people talk about the stigma of mental health. It's not really the stigma of mental health that's the problem. It's the fact that people are jerks and they exploit any sign of weakness in another individual in order to undermine anything that they say, which goes against what it is that they're saying, or which calls them out on certain behavior. So if you're calling someone out on their behavior and they're saying, oh, you have a mental illness, therefore you're not capable of actually figuring out that I'm full of crap, then you know you are dealing with a very shady person. So as I said in my last video, there's these kind of concentric circles with you in the middle, and then your social circle directly surrounding that, and then the economic and political circle outside of that. And that's generally the reality that most people live with. But there's actually another overlapping circle which we should be aware of as Christians. And that is the God circle. That is the circle that encompasses everything, and which should be first and foremost in our lives if we have dedicated ourselves to Jesus. So I've said it before, and it has not ceased to be true, so I'll say it again, which is that there are some people in the world and in your close circle of friends and family who believe that they should be the God of your life. So they want to be the authority in your world. They want to be the one in control of you. And they are the sorts of people who don't submit to the real God because they don't want to have anyone else in control of their reality. They don't want to be subject to any kinds of rules or accountability or responsibility. They want to essentially have all of the authority without any of the responsibility. But that's not really how authority works. Like, you cannot have authority without responsibility, because if you are the decision maker, then you have to be culpable for the decisions and for the outcomes. And so in my video on narcissism, that's essentially one of the biggest problems that they have, is that they want all of the control, they want all of the authority, they want to lord it over people, but then they don't want to be held responsible for what it is that they've done. And a lot of us have narcissistic traits. Like, sometimes it's a survival thing. It's not necessarily a toxic personality disorder thing. And that's why the gospel is very challenging, because what scripture tells us is like the antithesis of narcissism. It's where we have to put up with a whole bunch of ill treatment. So it's not particularly good for survival. It's not an advantageous way of operating in the world. Your life expectancy and your wealth expectancy is not going to be great. But that is the price that we are expected to pay, which is why Jesus said, "If you are not prepared to take up your cross and follow me, you are not worthy of me."
Do not think that I came to bring peace on earth. I did not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to set a man against his father, and a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. And a man's enemies will be those of his own household. He who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me, and he who loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me, and he who does not take his cross and follow after me is not worthy of me. He who finds his life will lose it, and he who loses his life for my sake will find it.
So you'll encounter a few different responses when you do preach the gospel in its proper entirety. So you'll get a lot of people in Christianity who want to preach the good news. But the thing is, like, why is it good news? Why do we need this? What's it for? And so the good news is only good news if there's bad news. So the bad news is everyone has fallen short of the glory of God. Everyone has sinned. Everyone is in need of redemption because they have ultimately failed at being their own kind of God. And so the good news is that Jesus redeems us. So you'll get a lot of Christians who want to quote John 3:16, but then they kind of stop there, and it's like, that's not the full message that Jesus was preaching.
For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved. He who believes in him is not condemned, but he who does not believe is condemned already, because he has not believed in the name of the only begotten Son of God. And this is the condemnation, that the light has come into the world, and men loved darkness rather than light, because their deeds were evil. For everyone practicing evil hates the light, and does not come to the light, lest his deeds should be exposed. But he who does the truth comes to the light, that his deeds may be clearly seen, that they have been done in God.
So the rest of the message is difficult, and a lot of people do not want to know that part. They want to know God loves me. I'm so lovable. Of course God wants me in his life. Why would he not want me? I'm amazing. People are very keen on that message. They're not so keen on the rest of the message, which says that if you do not humble yourself and come to God, then that's because you want to dwell in darkness. So even people who ultimately love you and who ultimately want what's best for you, they will be very offended by this particular message. I know that even with my dad, it didn't go down well when I told him why I had decided to be Christian. His whole philosophy is that if you live a good life, if you do good deeds to others, then that's enough. And I was like, well, technically, no. Technically, you can't really be good enough. And that's okay, because we have the redemption of Jesus. But of course, it tends to come off as what the world calls judgmental.
Judgmental Christians, the sheep is judging you.
But realistically, for Christians who have met God, who have been convicted of sin, who understand that hell is a real place, for us, it's not about judging people, it's about saving people from a fate worse than death, from the fate of the second death.
Then I saw a great white throne, and him who sat on it, from whose face the earth and the heaven fled away, and there was found no place for them. And I saw the dead, small and great, standing before God, and the books were opened. And another book was opened, which is the book of life, and the dead were judged according to their works, by the things which were written in the books. The sea gave up the dead who were in it, and death and Hades delivered up the dead who were in them, and they were judged, each one according to his works. Then death and Hades were cast into the lake of fire. This is the second death. And anyone not found written in the book of life was cast into the lake of fire.
And so the gospel is bittersweet. It's like the passage in Revelation where John takes the little scroll and he eats the little scroll and it tastes sweet in his mouth, but then when it gets to his stomach, it's bitter. And that's kind of the reality of Judgment Day. So when Jesus returns to judge the earth and the earth will be destroyed, then it's going to be bittersweet for Christians, because on one hand, we will finally be with the Lord and it will be a joyous meeting. And then on the other hand, people that we know and love are going to perish. And that's why in amongst taking up your cross to follow Jesus, you also cannot love anyone else more than you love Jesus. It just means not loving as much, not choosing them. So I do have an example of the fallout that you might encounter with this sort of thing. I haven't actually had too much fallout with anyone, thankfully. Maybe it's because I'm not shoving it down people's throats. There's evangelism and then there's that. And so it can be a really difficult line to tread, because you don't want to alienate people from God, but at the same time, you do need to be honest. And so I am still friends, at least Facebook friends, because I'm in a different state. But I am still friends with people who were witch friends, like witchy friends, people from the pagan community, from the Druids and from the New Age. Actually, no, I'm still friends with people in Tasmania. I go hiking with a friend of mine who is in the New Age. And so it's not advised in the Bible to have fellowship with people who are on a different path, but at the same time, how are you supposed to evangelize if you don't have some fellowship? So it's kind of like trying to find a balance with that, still maintaining a presence in people's lives without rejecting them. You're not necessarily supposed to reject people, but sometimes they will reject you. So I'm gonna show you an example of pretty much the only friendship that I lost in this particular fallout.
Okay, so this particular situation is not one that I was terribly well equipped to handle at the time that it happened. So I was probably weeks into being born again, and I had really no idea what to do when attacked by friends. And so this turned up in my messenger a few days after thousands of people had decided to rip into me on YouTube because I was saying that what they believed in was the path of destruction. So they were extremely angry, and of course this particular friend was extremely angry. So you might notice in this that on one hand she's like, I'm having a hard time processing the frankly rude and condescending tone in your video, and then proceeds to say, are you doing okay? Which on the face of it would potentially be like, I don't know, emotional whiplash. It's a very strange message and a little bit coercive. It's like, this doesn't sound like you at all. I thought you were more accepting of other people's beliefs. So this is something that you might come across. So it's fairly manipulative to say, I thought you were a good person and now you're not because you don't agree with me about something. But you'll notice my response underneath was rather nonplussed about the hypocrisy, and you might be wondering, what hypocrisy? Well, I'll show you. So on the left-hand side, we have the Facebook post that I was referring to in the message, which she had posted about a month and a half before, and at the time I just hadn't responded. The thing is, like, I don't necessarily disagree with what she's actually sharing in terms of people overreacting to lockdowns at the time and kind of equating it to Nazi Germany. I mean, it's not, definitely. So I don't necessarily disagree with her ideas, but the way that she delivered it was extremely aggressive. And as you can see from the Twitter feed on the right-hand side, that's actually pretty typical of how she behaves. She's extremely aggressive on social media towards family, friends, and strangers. So I got this message from basically the rudest and most intolerant person that I knew, aside from her husband, who I will get to very shortly, because that's also kind of relevant. But yeah, she sent me this particular message, and I really should have, before this particular time, addressed her behavior with her independently of this, and I never had. Like, when you're dealing with someone who is very aggressive, it's much easier to basically just let it go because you know for a fact that you're going to have a fight on your hands if you actually hold them accountable for their bad behavior. So I really shouldn't have been so cowardly beforehand and failed to really talk to her about the way that she behaved towards people, because when it came to this conversation and I was already dealing with a whole bunch of people who were being very nasty towards me, and then this friend was doing the exact same thing, I chose this particular moment to address her behavior, and it wasn't the right moment because now, of course, she associates me criticizing her behavior with me being Christian. And it really didn't have anything to do with that. I was already disgusted with how she behaved, and in particular how her husband behaved. And so I was already in a position where I kind of did not like her as a person anymore. And I really shouldn't have muddled that issue up with the issue of Christianity. And so that's one of the problems that you get into when it comes to dealing with people who you know, because there's history there. And sometimes there's really, really bad history. So let's have a look at what went down with her husband. Okay, so this was her husband's tweets on the left-hand side, and then the messages that he sent me after the conversation that I had had with his wife. And yeah, I don't have the original post from Twitter because I think he deleted it. And the original post was overtly racist, which, as you can see from the replies here, he was busy trying to justify. I hadn't gone off at him. I had simply said, like, you can't generalize about an entire race of people based on a few people that you've met that you didn't get along with. That's the definition of racism. And I had brought this up in the conversation with his wife because they know that my nephews are Aboriginal. And so he wasn't just being racist on social media, which is bad enough. He was actually targeting my family. So he and I were already not friends, and I don't know how much of that he had actually told his wife. I'm guessing probably none. And I hadn't originally brought it up in the past, when I probably should have. So again, I shouldn't have mingled this particular argument with the whole conversion to Christianity thing, because now in their minds, they are justified in hating Christians because a Christian started to hold them accountable for bad behavior where she hadn't done that before. And so they just think that I'm insane now, according to this particular message, even though it's like I was already pretty disgusted by what they did beforehand. So I'm actually able to show you what it is that my particular former friend does think now, because I stumbled across it on social media. And so this is why it's an example of what not to do and things that I wish I had have known originally. But, you live and learn.
Okay, so I have a confession to make. I finally got around to watching a video which was made about me. This was after I did my repentance video on my former Witchcraft channel, and so I did only like 2 videos about my conversion, and then I was like convicted that all of these subscribers that I had were essentially like ill-gotten gains, and that I needed to start from scratch. I needed to rebuild anew. So after I posted my initial repentance video, so I was like, I am deeply sorry for what I have taught people, and please be warned, this is not good. So that was the intent of the video. I didn't expect it to have a very warm reception, and it didn't. So that was not unexpected, but at the same time, it was like, after a while, you just get tired of the hate. So someone did actually make a response video to what I had posted, and it's not a hate video. So I just want to make that absolutely clear. I watched about the first 10 minutes of it, so I didn't watch the whole thing because she kind of does her response in the first 10 minutes, and then after that she goes into like why she likes witchcraft, and I was like, I probably don't need to watch that part. So her response video, even though her initial reaction was very emotional, and she kind of acknowledged that in the beginning, even though her initial reaction was quite emotional, she did attempt to make a very thoughtful analysis and response of what I had said. But obviously, we both have our own biases. Obviously, I am biased towards Jesus because I have met God. So that's a very defining factor in my particular journey. Whereas people who are in the New Age, who are in witchcraft, they have not had the benefit of that experience yet. They have a different set of experiences. And so that's essentially what they are basing their philosophy on. So it wasn't like nasty or anything like that, but it was very biased. And so we actually had a fairly friendly conversation in the comments section after I watched about 10 minutes, and I was like, okay, so you heard this particular message that actually wasn't the message that I was transmitting. It's this thing in psychology where someone says something. So when you are attempting to talk to people about the gospel, it doesn't really matter how careful you are in preparing your message. They are going to have filters that they translate that message through. And so what they hear is not necessarily what you say. And that's why you kind of have to have a bit of patience with people. You have to understand that they are going to have their own biases. They are going to have their own experiences. A lot of them will have bad experiences with different churches and with different Christians that they've met. And so that is going to be the filter that you're trying to get your message through. And it can be really, really challenging. So I don't really have any issue with her video. Like, she is entitled to her opinion. She's entitled to her own particular journey and trying to figure things out. I definitely hope that she does figure things out for herself, because from my own vantage point, what I have discovered to be true about the spiritual realm is that there is only one Lord and Master, and if you are not allied to him, then you are estranged from God. And so, of course, I hope that everyone will be saved. As it says in the Bible, God is not willing that anyone should perish. And so the task of Christians is to try and reach as many people as we possibly can. But not everyone is going to be receptive to it. And that's just something that we have to be able to accept. So I watched the video, and then I made the mistake of having a look in the comments section. So obviously the comments are not the opinion of the actual YouTuber. And I will link the video in the description box underneath if you want to check it out. I don't know if you want to check it out. I mean, mostly it's not necessarily attacking Christians. Mostly it's just people having a gripe at me as an individual. So you might just find it interesting.
Okay, so this is why I say that how I handled it before is an example of what not to do. Because this was one of the comments that I came across in the comment section, which was from my former friend, who we knew each other for 20 years, as she says. I was her bridesmaid, she was my bridesmaid. We were at one point fairly close. And so picking your moments to address someone's behavior so that you're not entangling it with things like the gospel, because they're not related and it does interfere with the other person's perception of what Christianity is. And so I don't think that that was the best way that I could have handled it. Were there problems with her behavior and her husband's behavior? Yes, definitely. Should have addressed that at a different time and kept the two things separate. So rather than being able to understand why it was that I chose God over popularity and over acceptance, She doesn't really understand that aspect at all. And at the same time, she also doesn't understand what it is that I was addressing about her behavior. So she doesn't understand either of those things because I confused the issue. And so the whole point of both sides of those conversations was completely lost on her. And that's why this is a very good example of a very bad way to handle it. And I will very shortly show you how to handle it properly.
So yeah, it can be very disappointing when you realize that the people that you have in your life that were at one point very close to you, when you realize that ultimately they do not accept you if you choose Jesus over them. And again, it comes back to these filters that we have when it comes to communication, because, you know, she had her particular filters and I had my particular filters. So my particular filters was the context of like seeing this terrible behavior for years on end and being really, really disturbed by it and quite disgusted by it. And then having this same person attempt to lecture me. And I was just like, no. Like, if you're going to take advice from people on how to behave towards others, it's not going to be the person who has the worst track record of how they behave towards others. So yeah, I had been resisting the urge to have a very difficult conversation with this particular person. And in the end, what came out was a lot of frustration with other people's behavior. And so that can be really challenging when you are making a particular declaration and other people, for one thing, bring up everything that you've ever done, like being divorced twice and having a gay brother. So it's like you're not going to be acceptable to God because you had to be forgiven for stuff. And it's like, yeah, that's the point. So part of what you'll get from people is this mock concern where they're like, you're clearly not in your right mind. You're clearly not able to think rationally because this is not rational. This is arrogant or rude or not tolerant of other people's beliefs and stuff. And it's like, you want to be a good person, don't you? You want to be tolerant of everyone. When you're a brand new Christian, like straight out of the birthing process, you're not really going to have the patience and the forbearance to deal with people who go on personal attacks. So if I had to give some advice on how to handle a situation like that again, I would say just don't respond. Like, just don't have that conversation because they're not going to be listening anyway. They're certainly not going to be receptive to any kind of criticism, even if that criticism is legit. So yeah, you'll get a few people who are all about saying, do as I say, not as I do, and don't disagree with me, because if you disagree with me, then I will call you all sorts of things, and you will not be allowed to disagree with me about that. Don't disagree with me in the first place. And then if you disagree with me about me telling you not to disagree, then I'm going to disagree about that. So essentially everyone is going to have an opinion about the decisions that you make. And if you publicly declare something the way that I did, they're definitely going to have an opinion on that. But that's kind of the thing about witchcraft in general. I don't know if you've explored much of that particular background, much of that particular community, if you come from there, or if you're just Christian and curious about this stuff, how to deal with people like that. But the whole thing about the occult and witchcraft is Aleister Crowley's motto was, "Do as thou wilt shall be the whole of the law." And that pretty much sums it up. Like, Wicca attempts to kind of soften that. Their particular theory is, and it harm none, do as thou wilt. But yeah, it's all ultimately about yourself. It's all ultimately about having your own way and exerting control over different situations. So witchcraft is absolutely about control. And that was something that I definitely noticed about myself when it came to changing from witchcraft to Jesus, is I relinquished control to Jesus because he's God. Like, God is the one who is in control. We don't have that kind of dominion. And that's one of the traps of witchcraft, is it gives people the illusion of control. They don't really have control. They just think that they do. And so in the Bible, it's described as a work of the flesh.
Now the works of the flesh are evident, which are adultery, fornication, uncleanness, lewdness, idolatry, sorcery, or in the KJV, witchcraft, hatred, contentions, jealousies, outbursts of wrath, selfish ambitions, dissensions, heresies, envy, murders, drunkenness, revelries, and the like, of which I tell you beforehand, just as I also told you in time past, that those who practice such things will not inherit the kingdom of God.
And so witchcraft can be about the urge to control situations, or it can be about the urge to control people. And so if you have people who are involved in that kind of work of the flesh, then they will attempt to control you. And when you don't follow the narrative, when you are not in their control, then they try to pull you back into line and make sure that you are conforming to their particular worldview. And then if you don't conform to their particular worldview, then you're going to have problems. So your social circle does exert a huge amount of influence over your life, but you don't really have any influence over them. I mean, you have a small amount of impact on other people. When people are trying to understand your journey, but they have no reference of their own to try and match it up with, it's challenging. And so you hope that they don't get the wrong end of the stick, but sometimes they just do.
Okay, so we've had all of the examples of what not to do from what I did. Now let's hear from someone who is actually a professional in this field, who has a ton of experience and who has written the book. The book called Tactics by Greg Koukl is absolutely brilliant. It's a fantastic resource for Christians who want to be able to have these difficult conversations, because people really are antagonistic towards Christianity, and they very much try and push and bamboozle and confuse the issue. And so Greg Koukl has some really amazing pieces of advice and real life examples that you can draw from in his book. So I'm going to go through some of what he's written, and you can see for yourself how this works. It may surprise you to hear this, but I never set out to convert anyone. My aim is never to win someone to Christ. I have a more modest goal, one you might consider adopting as your own. All I want to do is put a stone in someone's shoe. I want to give that person something worth thinking about, something he can't ignore because it continues to poke at him in a good way. In some circles, there's pressure for Christian ambassadors to close the sale. Get right to the meat of the message. Give the simple gospel. If the person doesn't respond, you've still done your part. Shake the dust off your feet and move on. In my view, though, this is not good advice. You don't have to get to the foot of the cross in every encounter. You don't have to try to close every deal. I think it's often better if you don't try. I have a number of reasons for this recommendation. First, the simple gospel is no longer simple. Yes, the truth is still the truth, it hasn't changed, but the world has changed dramatically. The basic theological concepts and the language we use to convey them are largely unintelligible now to many of our culture, especially the emerging generation. Second, objections abound now more than ever. Books hostile to classical Christianity raise sophisticated challenges and populate bestseller lists. They're convinced the smart guys have weighed in and found Christianity wanting, so they have little interest in giving us a hearing. Third, not all Christians are good closers. Yes, some are effective at getting a decision. For those with that gift, harvesting takes little effort, but something else is needed before the harvester can harvest. Gardeners working for a season until the fruit is ripe. There are two types of workers, sowers and reapers, gardeners and harvesters. Both were vital in their proper season, working productively together to the same end, so that he who sows and he who reaps may rejoice together. Here is the final reason I do not think it wise to make a beeline for the cross in every conversation. In most situations, the fruit is not ripe. The non-believer is simply not ready. She rejects a message she doesn't understand, and then she's harder to reach the next time. I encourage you to consider the strategy I use when God opens a door of opportunity for me. I pray quickly for wisdom, then ask myself, what one thing can I say in this circumstance? What one question can I ask? What single idea can I offer that will get the other person thinking? Then I simply try to put a stone in the person's shoe. Throughout the book Tactics, Koukl refers to a character by the name of Columbo, and if you're not a fan of repeats of 70s and 80s crime drama, then you've probably missed out on this gem. Columbo as a fictional character was quite brilliant. He always played this doddering fool, and he asked a series of questions as though he was completely ignorant of everything that was going on. So people would supply him with the information that he needed because they thought he was stupid. It was quite brilliant, and throughout this book, Koukl uses the same principles in order to actually tease out what people really believe and what they base those beliefs on. Would you like a model question that will help you get going? Here's the one I use. What do you mean by that? This question provides a natural opening to further dialogue, and it puts no pressure on you. How do you reverse the burden of proof when the other person is making the claim? You do it Columbo style, with a question. Here it is. How did you come to that conclusion? This question effectively shifts the burden of proof onto the challenger where it belongs. The third use of Columbo takes us more on the offensive, yet in an inoffensive way. We still use questions to keep our risk levels low and our comfort levels high. Here, though, since our queries have a different purpose, we ask a different kind of question, sometimes called a leading question. Ultimately, we want to win people over to our point of view, but we don't want the conversation to feel like we're forcing our opinions on them. Instead, we want to persuade them. When the steps to a conclusion are unambiguous, straightforward, and reasonable, it's much easier for someone to follow along with us on the journey because he can see the route clearly. He can even trace it on his own if he wants to. With each question, we lead him closer towards our destination. Remember, you're in the driver's seat. Once in a restaurant in Seattle, I got into a chat about religion with the waitress serving my table. My general comments about spirituality were met with an approving nod, but a shadow of disapproval crossed her face when I mentioned that some religious beliefs seemed foolish to me. "That's oppressive," she said, "not letting people believe what they want to believe." Now, much could be said about this challenge. Notice that she took my judgment of certain religious beliefs as a threat to personal liberty. I ignored that problem, though, and zeroed in on a more fundamental flaw. "Do you think I'm wrong, then?" I asked, using a variation of the first Columbo question. At this she balked, unwilling to commit the same error she had just accused me of making. "No, I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm just trying trying to understand you, she faltered. I chuckled. It's okay if you think I'm wrong. Really, it doesn't bother me. I just wondered why you don't admit it. Look, if you don't think I'm wrong, then why were you correcting me? And if you do think I'm wrong, why were you oppressing me? Of course, I didn't think her comment was oppressive, but now I was playing her rules against her. Boxed in, she hesitated for a moment, then changed the subject. All religions are basically the same, after all. It was a parry, a stock retort. I suspect it had worked for her before, and now she was trying it on me. But I noticed something about the comment. She had just made a claim, and it was up to her to support it. It was time for another Columbo question. Religions are basically the same. Really? In what way? I asked. My question had a remarkable effect. I was amazed at the impact those simple words had on her. Her jaw fell slack and her face went blank. She didn't know what to say. She had obviously not thought much about the details of various religions. If she had, she'd have known there are significant differences. Why the empty claim then, if she had no idea of its truth? I suspect she had gotten away with it before, stonewalling Christians who didn't know enough to ask for clarification. Finally, after a long pause, she came up with one similarity. Well, all religions teach you shouldn't kill people, you shouldn't murder. In point of fact, many religions aren't concerned with morality at all. A distinctive of the great monotheistic religions is their concern about ethical conduct, but that's not a standard feature of religion. All religions are not basically the same. Instead of lecturing her about it, though, I used my questions. Consider this, I said. Either Jesus is the Messiah or he isn't, right? She nodded. So far, so good. If he isn't the Messiah, I continued, then the Christians are wrong and the Jews are right. If he is the Messiah, then the Jews are wrong and the Christians are right. So one way or another, somebody's right and somebody's wrong. Under no circumstances can both religions be basically the same, can they? It was a straightforward line of thinking that should have yielded an uncontroversial conclusion, yet she ignored my question, regrouped, then continued. Well, no one can ever know the truth about religion. This is another assertion which should never go unchallenged, so I calmly asked, why would you believe that? The turnabout caught her by surprise. She was used to asking this particular question, I suspect, not answering it. I was violating the rules, asking her for a reason for her beliefs, and she wasn't prepared for the role change. I waited patiently, not breaking the silence, not letting her off the hook. Finally she ventured, but the Bible has been changed and translated so many times over the centuries, you just can't trust it. Notice two things about this response. First, she had changed the subject once again. The alleged corruption of the Bible has nothing to do with the possibility of knowing religious truth, even if the Bible vanished from the face of the earth. Some knowledge of God could still be possible, at least in principle. Second, her dodge was in the form of another claim, an assertion that it was her job to defend, not my job to refute. How do you know the Bible's been changed? I asked. Have you studied the transmission of the ancient documents of the text of the Bible? Once again, the question stalled her. No, I've never studied it, she finally said. This was a remarkable admission given her confident contention just moments before, but she didn't seem the least bit bothered. I didn't have the heart to say what I might have said in such a case like this. Then you're saying you are reasonably certain about something you know nothing about. Instead, I simply told her I had studied the question extensively and the academic results were in. The manuscripts are accurate to nearly 99% precision. The Bible hasn't been changed. She was surprised. Really? By this point, the waitress was running out of comebacks. She had watched her options evaporate one by one and was getting uncomfortable. I feel like you're backing me into a corner, she complained. I wasn't trying to be unkind to her or bully her intellectually. I had listened to what she had said and taken her points seriously, yet with each claim she made, asked fair questions she had no answers for. Apparently she'd never given any thought to the opinions she held with such confidence. A problem I encounter repeatedly with all sorts of people I talk with. She was dumbfounded by the challenges and felt boxed in. So, as you can see, this is a prime example of what you will encounter as a Christian, sometimes from strangers, but more often than not from people that you actually know really well. Again, this book is full of useful advice and examples. I highly recommend it to anyone who really needs a bit of extra insight. I know I did. The The hypocrisy and double standard which people throw at you is perfectly acceptable in their minds. Making unfounded assertions without anything to back it up, it's totally okay for them to do because they're right and you're wrong. If you hold them to their own rules or ask them to prove their claims, then you're being oppressive. But once more, they are entitled to oppress you. That's okay because they're exempt from accountability. They shirk all responsibility for actually having good reasons for what it is that they make claims for. And so this book really highlights the fact that sometimes just posing questions to people is more powerful than trying to defend what it is that you believe.
So, the other aspect of what I encountered from this particular former friend was she was messaging me to say, don't judge. I'm going to judge you for judging other people. I'm allowed to judge you. You're not allowed to judge anyone else. And this particular thing happens a lot where people are like, Christians are so judgmental. I'm going to judge them for being judgmental. You're not allowed to judge anyone. Is that a judgment? No. So yes, you will probably encounter that the judge not while I'm judging you. Yeah. So you get people saying don't judge, or you'll get people judging you hypocritically, and it's just very interesting to see. It's very strange. It's like, so let me get this straight. As a Christian, I'm supposed to be tolerant of everyone and everything, but everyone else is going to be intolerant of me, and that's good. Okay. So yes, you will encounter the double standard where it's like they are allowed to judge you, they are allowed to be hypocrites, you are not allowed to judge them, and you definitely cannot be a hypocrite because they will immediately call it out. And you shouldn't be a hypocrite. Like that is bad. But as you can see from that particular example, this is one of those situations where it's like, remove the plank from your own eye before you attempt to extract the speck from your brother's eye. And when you encounter this stuff, it can be really, really aggravating because like you can see what they're doing. It's pretty transparent, but they will deny it until they're blue in the face, and they definitely don't want to be held accountable. Like if you attempt to hold them accountable for what it is that they're saying and doing, they will be very defensive. They will be sometimes very offensive. And so one of the things that really helps to keep things in perspective and to not place so much emphasis on what other people think of you and what other people think about your decision and your particular journey is to remember the scale of this particular diagram, which is that God definitely outperforms the scale of everything else around you, whether it's the political and economic sphere, which frankly is so far out of the realm of your control that you probably shouldn't even worry about it. But he's also bigger than the circle of friends and family that you have around you who may or may not be receptive to the change that you're going through or the choices that you have made and the choices that you continue to make. And so in order to shift your focus and your attention away from the pressure of that social circle, which may or may not be supportive, it's good to have God in the perspective so that you can use him as a touchstone. So he is the rock of your salvation. He is who you turn to in times of crisis and in times of need. And he is always there. When it seems like your friends and family are quite hostile to what it is that you have dedicated your life to, then at least no matter what else happens, you always have God. And it's probably going to sound completely bonkers to anyone who is not in the same space, who does not have the same perspective. As it says, the gospel is foolishness to those who are perishing. It's always going to seem irrational. It's always going to seem like it's going against the culture, because it is going against the culture. Friendship with the world is enmity with God. And so all of the relationships that you have are just ones that you have to hold lightly. You don't have to convince anyone, you don't have to force anyone, you just have to present them with your decision, your testimony, and then the rest is up to them. So in the same way that you don't want people who are controlling to attempt to control you, you also don't want to try and control other people. God has respect for people's free will. And as one of my friends at church said, God is a God of consent. He will never violate your wishes, and he will never violate anyone else's wishes. So you can pray for people, but at the end of the day, it's one of those things that has to be a decision that that person makes. And you can definitely rejoice if they come to God and if they are saved. But you don't need to be too personally involved in it, because it's not your journey, it's their journey. That's their own personal relationship with God. At the end of the day, we all eventually give an account for what we have done and for the choices that we've made. And whether you believe or don't believe, everyone gives an account. And so we do kind of need to love people wherever they're at. Although at the same time, you need to be able to decide when to cut off those particular relationships where it's no longer a situation where you are able to hold it lightly because they are imposing on you. Because we are not to have fellowship with darkness, we are not to acquiesce to other human beings. Like, they are not the authority, God is the authority. And so you really have to figure out for yourself when you are giving too much ground to other people and their dominion in your life, because the only person who is supposed to have dominion in your life is God. So some people will try to debate you on various different things, and it's good to have solid reasoning behind your faith and to study the scriptures and to understand God's wisdom, because that will assist you to help people to understand God, hopefully. But some people are just arguing for the sake of arguing, like they're not really interested in actually listening to what it is that you're saying. We're not here to control anyone. We're not here to convert with the sword. And when people are definitely pushing your buttons and trying your patience, just try and take a step back, pray about it. This is all advice that I wish I had had at the time that I was talking to that particular friend, because I did not know very much at that point. I was newly saved, and it probably would have been good to have a few tactics up my sleeve of just taking a breath, not responding to the antagonism. Would it have made much difference? It's kind of hard to tell. It's very hard to tell with some people, because like those particular friends are extremely set in their ways and hard-headed. And there definitely was a track record of just picking fights with people. So I don't know if that conversation would have gone any better from taking a step back, but who knows. All right, guys, thanks so much for watching. Hopefully that was informative and useful. And let me know in the comments if you have other experiences with trying to share the gospel, and if you've had any success with it. that's always appreciated. In the meantime, take care, and I will see you next time. Bye.